We'll just have a few folks that are starting. So we are recording today's meeting, and as is our tradition, based on our local privacy laws here, if you don't wish to be recorded, then you should leave now, but we hope that you don't. Welcome everybody to the 79th monthly meeting of the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group, hosted by OCAD University's Strategic Innovation Lab, the S-Lab. I am here in Toronto, and we have people from Toronto and elsewhere on the call. I'll respond to the question in the chat indicating where you are and other information. Add that to the agenda page in our wiki for today, and Nicole is sharing the top-level wiki, and we'll share the agenda page in a moment. If you want to learn a little bit more about our speaker. So in the interest of keeping the focus on the content, we just record participation on the agenda page and let people find out who they are and updates it. So just to quickly introduce the group for those of you who haven't seen the introduction before, we are the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group. We're exploring how to enable entrepreneurs and established businesses to realize enterprises that choose flourishing as their goal, and that's been the work of our community of innovation practice since 2012. A quick acknowledgement of our privilege. This is a tradition that we've had because of our, originating because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we had in Canada between Canada and the First Peoples that were here before the settlers. And so we like to do an acknowledgement. Obviously, we're a global group, so we've generalized this to help you consider these questions from wherever you happen to be. So this is sacred land on which each of us are privileged to be today. This land, the nearby lakes and sea, has supported human beings for thousands of years and is rich in history, knowledge, and tradition. And we're privileged to be the beneficiaries and stewards of all that has come before on behalf of the 7 generations to come and beyond. And we invite you to consider in your place how you honour and respect peoples indigenous to your place, including, of course, for many of you, yourselves. And today, each place around the world is increasingly a home for peoples from across the world, and we're each grateful to have the opportunity to be where we are today. In addition to that more socially orientated recognition, we also like to do a biophysical recognition. So this photograph is where I am at the moment. I'm at the far end of that building, the lower part of that building, and this is downtown Toronto, part of the OCAD campus with the CN Tower in the background. And so we would like to ask you, do you know what watershed you are in? You can respond in the chat if you do happen to know. Where I am today, I'm sitting on the edge of a watershed that's known by the settlers as Russell Creek. We buried that to become a sewer in the mid-1870s, and I'm certain of its indigenous names. Of course, this session is interdependent in important ways on place, not least for those of you who use the toilet at some point. Think about where that's connected to. You're dependent on the ecosystem service. And for those of you who know the Flourishing Business Canvas, of course, this is why biophysical stocks and ecosystem services are on the canvas, because in fact we are interdependent on the place we are in many different ways. So that's a recognition of place. So who are we? We are 1,500 people globally now. We are the world's first or only group taking action to undertake enterprise strategy and to do organizational design action research from a micro-ecological economic perspective. So the ecological economics being those few economists who recognize that the economy is embedded in society, which is embedded in the environment. And we use systemic design as our fundamental epistemological approach, although we obviously leverage and use descriptive science approaches as well. And we have a strong normative purpose, which is enabling the possibility for flourishing. So this is what we believe differentiates us from some other groups out there doing work around enterprise strategy and business modeling and business design. So we get you. We are the home for you, we put our members, we put into practice what our members do research around and the latest thinking. So if you're taking the OCAD, NDES, SFI program or similar programs, we can help. And we offer a global network of possibilities for your education, your research, and employment. Group goals, I won't go through this in detail because I have some good news, which I want to share instead. As many of you know, the SSBMG is now the 79th meeting. We've been going since the beginning of 2012. And for the last 2 years, we've had an aspiration to move from being a volunteer group to a flourishing enterprise institute. So this was initiated by us as a do tank. And the idea is that we need to have a planetary-wide network of nodes undertaking action research and developing innovation practices to realize flourishing enterprises worldwide. And I'm pleased to announce that because of our new partner, the Wiesmann Center for Engagement in Research and Sustainability at Wilfrid Laurier, we're going to be hosting the first node of this network. We now have funding through SSHRC here in Canada to hold a research agenda setting meeting for the Institute, which SSBMG members are invited to join in August of this year. It's just after the Academy of Management meeting. And so if you would like to participate in that, please contact me or Nicole or as one of our community animators, and we will get you connected into that process. So the idea of this meeting is to build on the work that some of our members have already done on the research agenda for strongly sustainable and flourishing business models and all the things around business models, and to come up with a research agenda we can use to go and get more funding to build the institute to conduct the important research and development that we need to do. So this is really good news. The SSBMG is evolving. Absolutely delighted. Found this out just a couple of weeks ago that this is happening, less than a couple of weeks ago. And the Flourishing Enterprise Institute, of course, is part of a growing planetary movement for flourishing. Here's a sample of organizations and others who are involved, who are either claiming alignment or we see them as being aligned with what we're doing. And of course, this is very much in sync with the SDGs, but indeed going beyond the SDGs, because as much of the SDGs are an amazing gift from humanity to ourselves, of course, they are a political compromise, and strong sustainability is formally taking a science-based approach. So that's where we're trying to go beyond. We have lots of projects of our members. I just throw up the logos of 6 of them with a couple more that are trying to get started. All of these projects will be helped and enhanced by the Institute. We're starting to figure that out now. And of course, we have a number of other connections to other communities doing similar work. So here's the article by our leading member, Florian Rudek-Freud, who's starting to set the research agenda for us. We have the Systemic Design Conference for our epistemology. Next conference is in October. There's the New Business Models Conference in Berlin, at which many of us will be attending and presenting. We've got the work of Reporting 3.0 on new business models. That's also their conference is in end of June in Rotterdam. Many of us will be there. We've got our blog, Sustainable Business Models. We've also got the Institute for Evolutionary Leadership, the B Corp academic community, and here in Canada, the Academy for Sustainable Innovation are all connections and community that we work with. Won't go through some of the work we're doing in any more detail. I'll leave this slide in here. We are trying to get some additional projects moving. We hope the Flourishing Enterprise Institute will help with this. But this community has always been for our members, by our members. So if you've got an interest, you want to get some collaboration going on, particularly related to our research interests, then here's something you could get involved in, or you can propose your own. So we also have our monthly meetings, of which, of course, this is one example, and we've been doing that since 2012. Here's 4 recent examples of what we've been presenting. All of the presentations since the beginning practically are in our wiki. This is in the wiki, and the presentations and recordings are in our Google Drive, and we will be sharing this one afterwards as well. If you're a grad student or a researcher, we've got a list of ideas, and again, this will be input into our research agenda and opportunity as a researcher to get engaged with our community. So with that, all of that said, I'd like to hand over to this month's speaker, Oliver Laasch, who's going to be speaking about business model chemistry for sustainability. And Oliver, I'll let you know how you'd like to handle questions, whether you'd like to talk for a bit and then take questions, or take it as you go. And with that, I hand it over to you. Let me stop sharing and allow you to take over.
Yes.
So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, first of all, may I say thank you as well. I really enjoyed actually your introduction to the place, and kind of reminding us how we depend on where we are and what's been before us, and how we connect to what's coming after us. So thank you for that. I have to clarify one thing before I start going. I'm not a chemist. I'm not an alchemist either. So the metaphor that I'm going to use for my presentation today is one that came out of the work in business models I've been doing for the last 6-7 years, roughly, maybe a little bit longer than that, including the practical work. What I'm trying to achieve today, hopefully, is to take one step back to take two strides forward. And the one step back is to start rethinking once again what are actually business models. And I'm not really trying to kind of restart this whole discussion about what should be the boxes on the canvas and which one should be in which position. So it's not that kind of thinking back, but it's rather about how are we actually able to grasp how business models materialize. So how do we find the business model? How do we experience the business model? How do we touch the business model? And after all, how do we actually change it? Because we know what it is, which I'm not always sure we are. We do know. So anyway, before I get into the presentation, just maybe very, very quickly on who I am. I'm at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo in China, University of Nottingham's Chinese campus. I am officially a strategy professor, which is strange in a certain way, because where I come from are more social, environmental, and ethical topics, but also very fitting because through my PhD work back then, I was actually able to bring business model as a strategy concept together with social, environmental, and ethical topics. So let me just start the presentation. Hopefully, I'm not missing something here. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. So apologies if I appear a little bit unorganized, which I probably am right now, particularly in my head. I assume you can see the presentation now, can you?
Not yet, no.
Okay, that's interesting because I should do the sharing again, right? So that
yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's probably helpful. There we go.
And congratulations for getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I often we have people presenting from Europe late at night, but I'd forgotten that you are actually very early in the morning. So thank you very much for getting
up. No worries. It's my pleasure. It really is. And well, I probably have to give credits to my wife as well, who was putting 2 alarms and kind of pushing me out of the bed. So that definitely helped. Good. So let's see. I guess. So you can see my PowerPoint now, can you?
Yeah, if you just put that into slideshow, we should be good.
Yes, that's happening right now. Okay, good, excellent. Good. So where to begin, really? So this is kind of the end point of the presentation. I just wanted to show that because I felt probably it's good to know where we're going as we go. And in terms of questions, Anthony, I'm happy to take questions anytime. I just realized right now I cannot see the chat. So if there's something bubbling up in the chat, please do let me know. If you just want to switch on your microphone and interrupt me anytime, it's very, very welcome. And I would hope to actually do get quite a discussion going. So I want to give you just a snippet, kind of a preview on the practical parts of the presentation. So that's the kind of little goodies after we go through the more kind of demanding, harder stuff, if you want. So we're going to talk about 3 cases. Actually, I just added a 4th case to it, which I thought makes a lot of sense. So we're going to talk about how responsibility sustainability has been embedded into a big retailer. For confidentiality reasons, I'm not meant to say which one it is, but I think the example is still quite good and insightful. Then we're going to talk about supposedly circular bike sharing in China. So very practical hands-on experience I'm having day to day while living here, but also we had a small research project on that. And then we're going to talk about the business model of AllSafe, which is a automobile and space industry supplier in Germany, and they're supposedly having a humanistic and agile business model. And then the 4th one, which I just added, is on the company Grayston Bakery, a B Corp, which is all centered on open hiring. So the business model is built around the idea of open hiring. So this is kind of the practical goodies, which I hopefully don't lose you folks before we get to them. But what I'm hoping to happen is that we will actually be able to use this metaphor, this idea of business model chemistry, to, on the one hand, understand those cases better, but on the other hand, also to start thinking about how can we actually use that idea in order to change business models more effectively. And if I'm saying effectively, I'm not meaning effective in an economic sense, but effective rather in a sense of to have a change that's relevant, that's considerable, and a change that's tangible. But we're going to get to that in just a moment. So here's the one big step back. So what are business models actually made of? So this is very much, and apologies for getting philosophical to you folks, probably easier for you and for something in the afternoon than for me for in the morning, but the nature of being. So what are business models actually? And how can we experience them? And the idea of ontology is not really one that's unusual for business model thinking, because I think one of the very early origins, which is more the one on the right-hand side, is actually this business model ontology by Alexander Osterwald. And of course, there's been other people before him leading up to that work, Professor Gordy Jean, for instance. But I would like to take a small step back even from that, because before we get to the ontology in more a computer science information system sense, where this one came from, we do have the philosophical study of being, which is ontology. So what is the business model? How does it become? What's the reality of the business model? And of course, if we understand that a little bit better, well, hopefully it's easier to actually change business models, to create business models that are flourishing, that are strongly sustainable. So here just a couple of examples from that. Well, of course, there is Mr. Anthony Upward's work on the strongly sustainable one as well, so another type of ontology. But as mentioned before, I really want to go one step further, which is the example down there from Academy of Management Review. So really the question of what do we claim is reality? And what do we claim is the reality of a business model? So in order to not lose you from the very onset, from the very beginning, could I just quickly get maybe in the chat, or you want to speak up, an idea about so what is, so emphasis on is the business model to you? So what is the reality of the business model? How can you folks experience it? Any ideas? I know that's probably a tricky experiment so early in the beginning, but let's see if I can get you folks a little bit active. So I see Anthony typing over there. So also please feel free to just speak up, to unmute your microphone and say something at any time.
So I'm about to agree with Simon.
So sorry, I need to leave.
So Simon said, I've still not found anyone who is using the business model canvas who knows about Osterwald's ontology. I asked this question.
Really? That's surprising to me.
That's my experience too.
Yeah.
And I also
that's surprising to me. Great. Okay.
I've also my experience, and I know some others here have had a similar experience, but I'm curious as well. In fact, most people we meet in the work we're doing have not heard of the business model canvas.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah. So they know
this is very surprising.
They know the idea of a business model.
Right. They
know it's important, but the idea that you could describe it using a visual framework, using a standard language, is still not super common. I mean, Osterwald has sold a lot of books, but in the grand scheme of things, he's not sold very many books at all.
Huh. This is interesting, yeah.
It's really interesting for me. I know a lot of people working with business model canvas, and they don't even know the word ontology. They don't know that Osterwald has published business model.
Right.
So business model is really a case of, it's just a visual tool to get everyone on the same page as to why the business is in business, and its principal functions.
Yeah, interesting. So that's a really good learning for me as well, because I actually, before I started knowing about the word business model itself, I was using the Canvas back in Mexico, the second university I worked at actually, and we were helping people in the incubation process. So I got to know the business model as that visual, and I didn't even know it was called business model at that point in time. So that's interesting, because for me the experience was exactly the opposite way around.
In specific places, and I would say incubators and accelerators, because of lean startup. Yes. If you grow up in that world, you can't imagine it not being known. Yeah. But outside of that very small world, you talk to most business leaders, they haven't heard of it in established organizations.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
I mean, remember, it's not taught in business schools because it's a design tool, and business schools teach analytical thinking. They don't teach design thinking. So it's not.
Well, I mean, to some degree, although I must say that if I find business models in business schools, typically the canvas is somehow related to them. So I just earlier today actually had a chat with my colleague Haibu Zhou, who's teaching the social enterprise class here, and she explicitly uses the business model canvas, actually 3 different versions of the canvas as well. So that's one thing. And then the other one is that, and I don't know if you're somehow different here, but I'm assuming we're not in that sense. But also the strategy colleague who teaches a class called Strategy Process and Practice, he actually builds up much of the strategy implementation on the canvas and on business model thinking. So that didn't have anything to do with it. So that in both of those cases, that indigenously came out of their work.
I'm being a little bit provocative, and I know that provocative statement is getting a little out of date, but nevertheless,
Yeah. But that's good. That's really good. Okay, thanks everybody for getting into the conversation so early on. It's very much appreciated. So now that we're already talking about the business model canvas, so in my understanding, and I just have a very little background in the kind of information systems, management information systems world, out of which much of that kind of thinking came originally. But in my understanding, this is very much along the lines of this definition on the right here in computer science. So you're trying to kind of chop things up into all of its pieces so that you actually can translate it into probably most of the extreme case into a information system structure, which represents the whole reality. In this case, the reality being your organization or your business. So this is one way of seeing ontology, which I think is very valid. Although if we go into the philosophical world, and particularly kind of the metaphysical world, what we teach in research philosophy, which is one of the courses I'm teaching for our PhDs around here, the question really goes even one level deeper. But we're going to get to that just in a moment. But so originally, this is where the business model ontology came from. This is just screenshot out of Alexander Osterwalder's original thesis. So up here you see it saying business model ontology. Do you guys actually see my cursor when I'm moving it?
Yes, yes we do.
You do. Okay, great. So this is up here. So those four very basic areas: the product, customer interface, infrastructure management, he called it back then, and financial aspects. And he's also linking it back to a couple of other very well-known concepts, ideas in business and organization, or rather business and management studies. So then he's saying, well, we're actually moving from that low level of granularity, those 4 areas, to something that's a little bit more sophisticated and detailed, and more splitting it up into, and this is already very close to the canvas: product, meaning value proposition; customer interface, being target customer distribution, and so on. So you folks know all those stuff, all those segments, parts of the canvas, the building blocks, because this is what probably everybody's very familiar with. So those are the very same ones. So this is one type of business model ontology, one description of what the business model actually is. But if we go, well, and then of course we do have kind of the more sophisticated and more updated and more kind of world conscious sustainability, strongly sustainable versions like your own, Anthony. But still we see the very same type of structures. So we do have what Alex Osterwalder had over here as customers, but a little bit more broadly as stakeholders. We have the processes over here, which is more the kind of value creation part that we had on the left-hand side. measurement instead of only calling it financial or economic factors, because, well, we're not only in a financial and economic world. So I would say that's more kind of the world open idea of what it is, and then of course the different contexts. And apologies for obviously getting it all wrong, because you know it much better than I do, Anthony. But
you did a fine job of summarizing it, Oliver.
But again, so it's a kind of description of what it is, but still we don't, and of course I have my own version of that, which is not as sophisticated, but goes along the same lines of thinking very much. But still, I think all of those step one are one step short of actually thinking, but how can we actually touch it, see it, feel it, experience it? So what is that actually once it becomes real? Because right now what we're looking at is just an image which is still on a very removed conceptual level. But what is the real business model once we're actually looking into businesses? So is it just a piece of paper? Is it just the canvas that we print out? Is it the canvas that we start working on a whiteboard and start filling in all of the different bits and pieces of our business? Because if we so what we're typically doing is trying to create new businesses or change businesses based on that canvas, right? But the question is there really very much, does it become real? Is it something that stays on the canvas, or does it actually change the business reality itself? And one of my PhD students, Xuan Ye, is a venture capitalist. So he is very much in the business of making business plans, respectively, often the kind of business model descriptions inside business plans real. But the question there's really, he was telling me today, that there's a lot of research on how real a business plan and a business model canvas included in that actually becomes. So to what degree does the businessman match business performance, for instance? And he was telling me that there's kind of a huge difference, that very often the business plans are more pieces of fiction than they are and actually have an actually planning purpose, or that they're actually really becoming something that exists afterwards. So this is really the intent of going one level below that type of ontology, describing the elements on a conceptual theoretical level, but really thinking about what it actually is. And I'm using that chemistry metaphor here to once again trying to get this one level deep and trying to see what is it actually once we look at it in a real organization, in a real business. And I'm just stopping for a moment to see what's going on in the chat window as well, to make sure I'm keeping up to date with the discussion as well. So just a moment, trying to navigate this here. There is.
I was just making a point. This is.
Yes, please speak up, Simon. Yeah.
This is really, sorry for not introducing myself fully, but for the sake of time, it's in the chat. This is a really interesting question when you said, how do people really connect with the business model? Because my wife and I, Maria, we teach customer experience at business schools. And it's incredible how a lot of people struggle with the question, what is a customer experience? And this is where the business model and the value proposition are fully articulated in the world of people. And some people struggle and think, oh, a customer experience, it's only for wealthy people. It's only for people who can really afford a high quality service. It's like, no, every single business model and value proposition is expressed in a customer experience. And I think this is a really interesting discussion because many people inside of organizations are not connected with the customer experience, which is where the business model is expressed. So that was the point I was trying to make. I think your question is really excellent.
And I think I want to throw in the perhaps very obvious thing to say, which a business model doesn't exist in reality because it's a model. It is by definition a representation, a partial representation of reality, of experience. And so if we're asking, are we asking, Oliver, with this chemistry question, what are the elements of the reality, or are we asking the elements of the model of reality? Which question are you asking?
Yes. So I start with one and end up with the other one. Thanks for actually bringing me back in by asking that question. But let me just see. There's one more chat contribution. Is this the tension between transactional focus and the relational focus at the heart of the business model? Okay, interesting question. Yeah. So I think we're going to get to that, Douglas, and maybe you can bring it up once again, particularly when we talk about those different cases, because I think that's something that's probably best discussed looking at those real cases. So Anthony, your point about oh, now I've got the chat window in front of my presentation, which actually is helpful. Sorry, let me see. I think now something funny happened. Oh, now I'm back. Okay. So Andy, your question: what are we talking about, the model, or are we talking about the reality? And are we talking about the elements of the model and the reality? And hopefully we're doing both in a certain way. Because if you go back to what Alex Osterwalder called a kind of more kind of a rough kind of structure of the business model, just those four elements, I think we get something that we probably find both in the models and in the real business model, whatever that is. We're going to get to that just in a moment. So and I'm sticking to the chemistry metaphor. I'm trying to do something very similar to, you see there's hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. So that's the non-chemist speaking, of course. I'm very ignorant in terms of those. I'm a little bit more knowledgeable about the respective elements on the business model side. So typically I'm trying to break them down in those kind of very broad categories. So the proposition, which we just talked about, then there's certain value creation activities. So often you call that kind of the value architecture, the things you do and the things you have in place in order to create that value exchange. So somehow you have to move value between your different stakeholders. If we go back to Anthony's model, as much in the value creation, you exchange value back and forth as also in the actual use and capture of the value after all. Interesting, I've gotten quite a bit of criticism on the exchange part, because people, particularly reviewers in journals, particularly strategy journals, say, no, this should be delivery because the value is going from the organization, from the company to the customer. Yeah, well, fair enough. But at the same time, in an actually not entirely commercial world, if you look at a little bit less simplistic organizations, well, it is exchanged back and forth. We've got co-creation activities and so on. So just staying on the delivery side for me doesn't work, but I understand that there's people who see that differently. So
Oliver, the way we've dealt with people who don't understand this is we point them towards the service oriented, service dominant logic rather than product logic. Yeah. And given that came out of marketing with no in a completely profit normative environment, that usually helps people understand why we don't like value positions and but we like value co-creations and value exchange.
Yeah. And interestingly, something I just realized yesterday preparing that for that presentation was that Alex Osterwalder actually using value exchange in his very thesis. So apparently he still had kind of a more open perspective, if I may interpret that, while he's not here, in terms of how value moves around in those structures. So not just from left to right. Yeah.
It was when the canvas decided on the icon of the gift wrapped present that he moved from value exchange, at least superficially value exchange, to value delivery.
Yes, excellent. No, so I was actually very happy to see that, because now I can say, look into the original publications. Actually, that's not something new; it's been there forever. But the point I'm trying to make is that at least when we stay on the conceptual level, so on our removed abstract level of what the business model is, we actually know quite well what those different elements of the business model are. And of course, we probably disagree on the exact words from time to time, and we might disagree on kind of the subcategories we've got under those elements, but on that kind of granular level, as Alex Osterwalder called it, well, here we probably most of us do agree. So, but the question then still is, and you called it a logic before.
Before you move off this slide, So in this group, we've got quite a few people who know the viable systems model by Stafford Beer. And so the term viability is one that we tend to band around a lot. And I've always personally had a bit of a problem with the idea of value capture, because in the profit first way, it's all about you measure whether or not you're capturing in terms of financial profit. And so I wonder, how would it feel to you if we said viability equals PCE? PCRE, I should say, and capture was actually the result, which is viability.
Could be, yeah. I think that would be one good way of describing the capture. I mean, for me, all of those elements, I'm trying to choose the broadest and most open kind of mental image of what they are. So for capture, for instance, right now we're in the process of publishing the paper that you guys mentioned in my introduction and in the invite, which how did the Leopards get their spot paper, where we're looking at FTSE 100 companies' descriptions of business model and how they bring sustainability, responsibility, ethics in there. And so when we're trying to identify value capture, which is not the traditional commercial value capture among those companies, it comes in many different ways. So they talk about the triple bottom line, which would be, of course, once again, this kind of static capture, but they also talk about capture in terms of their license to operate, so being able to continue the business. So, and that's closer probably to your notion. Or they talk about capture in terms of community welfare, or they're talking about Pearson, the education company. They're talking about valuable learning for the people using the educational materials. So I think capture can come in many different forms, and one of the forms, and going back to ontology, there is not necessarily having kind of a static capture. Look, we've got a bucket and that's in there, but capture can also be the continuation of the business. And Sally Randalls and I, in that kind of very cryptic and hard to read paper that we did for Organization Environment, especially same special issue that yours was in, there we are actually talking about economic reproduction mechanisms, or more broadly reproduction mechanisms. So this is more along the lines of viability, about long-term existence, not sustainability as an outcome, but sustainability as a process type of thinking, what capture could be. Yeah. So I've without being too knowledgeable about Stafford Beer's work, I think some aspects of it actually go quite closely to, well, at least going into that direction to some degree. Yeah. Good. So basically, so this is where the metaphor came from originally. I was looking at this and was thinking, oh, well, okay. So that looks a little bit like a chemical formula like H2O, for instance. So and then I started thinking, okay, so why? So what can we actually learn from that metaphor? So if you think it through in those ways, we actually know that H2O as water not only comes in the liquid form, right? So we know it comes in gas form as well. It comes in solid form as ice, and we do know that there's certain processes between those aggregate states that move it from one form into another. So I was thinking, so what might that actually mean on a business model level? So, and if you use that kind of metaphor then to ask a couple of questions. So, is it actually, so what is this strange logic that we have underlying the business model as a model? So the kind of conceptual representation, is that logic, that PCEC, or however you want to call it, is that formula actually something that materializes, that manifests in reality as well? Or is it something that just kind of people who think more conceptually, theoretically use in order to make sense of the world? Or is it something that actually exists? If it exists, does it just float in the air somewhere, or where is it? What is it? And then, of course, also, but for me being as a researcher, interesting is how can we actually study it? So how can we see it, experience it, measure it, hear it? How can we actually start saying there is something that we can study and that we can analyze? And then the third question, of course, and that's one that has a lot of practical implications, is once we know what it is, how can we actually change it? So how does the reality of a business model change? Has it changed just because we changed the canvas? So let's imagine there's this kind of consultant coming into an existing corporation and saying, ooh, we're going to change your business model now. Look, we've got this great canvas and I printed it out in A0 format. So we've got it on a really huge scale. You guys change your business model right now. just start drawing things on the canvas and it miraculously is going to materialize in your business. Does that mean the business model changed? Does that actually mean anything with doing that? So those are the type of questions I would like to kind of explore with you folks a little bit. And it really is an exploration because I have never done that presentation before. And I've talked about those topics in different forms and discussed it. But really, this is an experiment, hopefully, together with you to find out how can we get something out of those questions. And to find out how those questions actually make sense. So that point about existence, I'm just looking at the chat window real quick over here. Right, so once again, strategy development execution as well, right? So if you talk about strategy execution, we want to know that something materializes. We want to know that the strategy doesn't just stay somewhere as a cloud in the air. It's something that actually materializes in the business and that does make a change, yeah. So, and if you look into the kind of more theoretical world of business models, probably some of you folks know this paper by Lorenzo Massa and colleagues, where they talk about different perspectives on the business model. So perspective still suggests in a certain way it's something that's conceptually removed. So we're looking at it through a certain lens and we're studying it. But I think it's very helpful because they talked about kind of the cognitive or linguistic schemas type of idea. So the business model is not only something that is like theoretically removed, it's something that people actually use in their day-to-day language. So for instance, Grayston Bakery that we're going to talk about a little bit later, they're saying, well, we're not baking brownies. We're not hiring people to bake brownies, but we're baking brownies to hire people. So this just very simple tagline, this slogan, this linguistic schema, as they would call it in this paper, in a nutshell, explains the business model. And this is something that exists in the company. That's something that you hear. This is something that people externalize when you ask them about what they think their business model is. So it exists in the body, in the body and head in a certain way, in the mind of people, and therefore it's embodied in people. Then we do have, of course, the ones we know. So we've got kind of formal, often more conceptual representations of how a firm functions. So the business model canvas probably being the most known of those. But then they're saying, well, we also have those as attributes of real firms. So those are actually things that are being done. And they're referring to this activity systems perspective on business models. Zott and colleagues, for instance, talking about what are the typical activities of an airline business model, in this case, a low-cost airline business model. And then I think, then we've got Anthony saying here, I think
So Oliver, just before you move off, I mean, what's coming up for me here is a point that Russ Aikoff and one of his students, Jamshid, I always mispronounce his surname, Gujarati, made, which is organizations are multi-minded, purposeful systems. And which talks to what the sociologists have always understood, which is organizations are socially co-constructed.
Yeah.
And so,
did you say that was Sylvia Girardi? Is that right?
Jamshid Gujarati.
Okay. Because I'm working with somebody called Sylvia Girardi, so I was just wondering. But no, that's somebody else. Yeah.
No, different person. But the point here is what this is reminding me about is that. If that is correct, that organizations only exist when more than one person believes that they do, right? It's like money, right? If you and I believe this piece of paper is worth something, right, it's worth something. If one of us doesn't, it's not worth anything at all. So if that's true, then from an empirical perspective, there isn't a real thing about an organization because it's all just in our minds. Right.
And that's exactly why I'm trying to evoke those kind of rather philosophical questions, because if we're talking about the nature of being, so what exists, what is real, right? So there's many different perspectives of it. So what you're talking about now as social construction. So if you are in a positive world where you're saying the only real thing is the thing that I can touch and take a picture of in the most extreme sense. If you're in that world, probably what's happening in your head is not real. But at the same time, if you are in a constructivist world, constructivist here in the philosophical sense of saying, okay, well, the world actually is, so in the most extreme position there, nothing exists out there unless you actually have it in your head. So whatever you don't see, whatever you don't think about isn't in existence, right? So this would be the extreme opposite position. So what we're trying to do here or what I'm trying to get to in this page is actually to bring together those different ideas of reality in a very inclusive way and say, okay, well, all of them are real in one way or another. Yeah. So depending on where you stand, you might have a preference for studying or understanding or changing the things that are physically there, that are materialized, or you might have a preference if you're a pragmatist in a philosophical sense, you're more interested in the activities going on. Or if you're a social constructionist, maybe coming from the psychology lens, for you the most real thing is what's happening in people's heads. So, but that doesn't really, if you're inclusive, that doesn't really mean any of those is unreal. It just means that we've got different ways of describing reality and different perspectives, different ontologies of what is real. Yeah. So this is the kind of.
I think I just made the observation in the chat that I think this speaks to exactly why business models are so seductive, because they actually make something that is fundamentally not real in a way, but yet it's only a model of something that isn't real.
Right.
It might be a real model, we might have it on a piece of paper, which makes it, quote, real in some objective way. But at the same time, it's a model of something that isn't real.
Yeah. So that piece of paper, so if the example before, like all of those nice things we drew on the canvas, they never happen, right? They stay in that room.
Yeah,
are they really real? Yeah. Are they really real? But at the same time, some people would say, well, at least in that manifestation of that. So now trying to move away from the model towards a logic perspective. So that logic of value proposition, creation, exchange, and capture, because then we can actually start saying, so this logic might actually be something that does exist in different forms. So we could say this logic actually, it does exist already at the point in time that we put it onto that board. But the point is it only exists in that one state. So it's real in this room, but it's not real somewhere else yet. So, but at that point in time, people start, so going back to the point about strategy implementation. Well, at the point in time, people take this thing out of the room. They start talking to others outside. They start explaining people how they could actually make it real, they could build activities around it. Once they start multiplying, duplicating in different forms, once they start designing products based on it, well, it becomes real in a different way. So there might be at the same time then what I call over here artifacts or materializations, so more things that express it. You might redesign a factory based on the logic by which your company is being run. So this logic, what used to be an abstract model, once we translate it into that logic, actually is something that becomes materialized as artifacts, as things, as stuff that's out there. It might become enacted through the activities what we have, so a different way of reality. And of course, at the same time, it becomes something that people have in their heads and that they use in order to organize their mind worlds around. Yeah. So this is the basic idea I would like to pitch to you guys, to start thinking about those kind of real parts of what the business model could be. If you stick to Lorenzo Massa and colleagues' idea about perspectives, this is ways how you can experience, how you can see it, and then of course also can change what it is. But at the same time, I'm actually trying to move one further level towards reality and saying those are different states, just like what we saw in the water example. So in a certain way, this logic that we have, which is not a model anymore, but actually a logic that exists in reality, well, it could be in people's heads, it could be at the same time materialized in artifacts, and it could be enacted as activities. So it becomes real through those different states of what the business model could be.
Oliver, Simon has a comment.
Yes, please jump in anytime. And please feel free to interrupt me anytime, because I might not see the chat window.
Go ahead, Simon. You're on mute.
Yeah, I actually graduated from Nottingham University in psychology, especially with a focus on cognitive psychology. I really like this particular model because in the comment section, we work with strategy and strategy execution. And we had one case where the senior leaders just wanted to communicate a strategic map. And I said, no, people across the, people the senior leaders wanted to communicate this across the whole organization, the whole hospital. And I just said, people really are not going to understand what a strategic map is. So in terms of your comment about what you've got to consider, cognition, artifacts and activities, we use storytelling and gamification, which really honors, the lived experience of each and every person. And when you use things like storytelling, gamification, you really take people into the business model in a way that honors their intelligence, honors their background, and you don't have to lose any complexity or detail. It's just you're working with their experience of the world. Recognize that they don't come from a business background, but these are intelligent people that can contribute to the development of the strategy.
Yeah. And I think that also, thanks a lot for that comment, very helpful, I think. And also I think it relates back to this kind of, not only the question like how does it manifest, how is it out there, so how is it real, but also how do you change from one state to another? So it's for some people, to make it real, if you want, horrible, that's a German person even trying to make English sound more wrong. Anyway, so to make it more real, you might actually have to move between those different states, because you of course you want the kind of representations, the kind of strategic map in this case to look very much like what's enacted out there, to look like the activities, and you want this to be consistent with what people have in their heads, ideally, right? So you're searching for consistency between those different states of what it is. So I think for me that's one of the main tasks of business model implementation, if you want to keep using that language, or business model execution, to actually make sure that those states correspond to each other, that they do align. But it also has quite a powerful point for changing business models, because it means that if you do change one of those states, the other ones, they're very likely to change as well, because they are connected, they are the same thing. So that they're different at one point in time doesn't mean that they cannot actually move and become the same, because one powerful change has happened in one of them. Yeah, I see there's a lot of activity going on. I see Simon nodding, so probably you want to jump back in.
Yeah, and I really like this because we shifted a company from doing having a communication session with all the senior directors on a stage, telling people what the strategic map was from the next 5 years, into a storytelling and gamification experience. And this created new feedback loops. And for the very first time, you had senior directors listening to everyone at every level of the organization. And because the actual strategy started to change in ways in which they hadn't really previously expected, because there was this new type of listening. So yeah, I like the changes of metaphor.
Yeah, excellent. And also, so I've seen it happening as well in a past kind of past engagement with one business, where actually those metaphors were the ones that, without me having any interference there, I was just a passive observer. I actually saw how the business model of that huge organization started changing just because of one metaphor. And the metaphor they were using was to say, we're using our scale for good. So they have a scale-based business model, being a huge retailer, and then saying, actually, we're using our scale, which is the essence of their business model, for good. Then and a metaphor that traveled throughout the business. They actually incrementally, but very pervasively throughout the whole organization, started becoming a more responsible organization, which is something that people might not even have understood as being a type of business model change. But as that metaphor was so closely related to who they are as a business and what everything they do was based on, that actually had a huge impact. So I perfectly buy into your point of saying, okay, if we just and I'm reinterpreting it here, hopefully that's an adequate reinterpretation. So if we're actually able to be those business model chemists, if we're able to play with those different states of the business model and find out which is the one that actually can most impactfully change the business model right now, I think that's a very, very powerful point theoretically, but even more powerful point practically. If you think about becoming business model chemists or alchemists who are able to change those different states of matter from one to another. Yeah.
So Oliver, let me go very practical here, just for a second.
Yes.
Building on what Doug and Simon have been trying to do. So one of the could you flip back to your three-row chart that has cognition?
Yes.
It's this one. So if we say that a business model canvas somehow tries to represent more of the bottom two rows, the artifacts and the activities, when you respond to the questions that a canvas asks and you write things on Post-it notes, it tends to be talking about things that are towards the bottom. But then when you tell a story, that's when you're linking those elements together through cognition. And that process, which if I use your other slide of the different states of water, is kind of like, it's almost like the story is the gas, and the other two are solid and liquid. And what's been very hard to communicate to people in a very practical way is what the process of sublimation and evaporation is. So people can do it intuitively, but how do you unpack that process so that they can do it reliably and consistently? And this is an extremely practical challenge that we face as business modelers. So this is very interesting.
Yeah, and this is also because very much. So I think this is also why this ontology question is so important, because when we talk about ontology in the classical sense that you've done and that Alex also started doing back then, you get the kind of static parts. So you get the building blocks, right? That's literally what you call them. But you're, in a certain way, I think you're distracting a little bit from the question about how do you actually move between them. So what are the processes of change in between? And going that step back, I think, leads us to exactly this question that you're asking. So what are the processes actually that are happening on those arrows, right? So how do you move from one to another? How do you make sure that the canvas becomes something that's enacted? How do you make sure that the canvas correctly interprets what people have in their heads? Or how do you use the canvas in order to start changing what people have in their heads so that they start enacting it?
So this is one of the very interesting things. This is one of the very interesting things that you lose in the move from the ontologies to the canvases. So in the ontologies, you don't only have nouns, you have verbs that link the nouns together, which are the lines between the boxes in the ontologies. But the lines here are not labeled, but in the deep version of this, and in Ostwalders, the lines are all labeled in both directions, and they're labeled with verbs. So the problem with the visual representation on the canvas is you lose all the verbs. The verbs are subsumed into the physical placement of the nouns next to each other. But unless you go looking, you can't see the verbs. And we've not yet found, Osterwalder, to our knowledge, has not done this, and we have not yet had the time to try. How can you help people get their heads around the verbs, but link the boxes together?
Hi, Anthony, can I make a quick comment? Well, one of our projects right now is using the Flourishing Business Canvas with the balanced scorecard methodology for a not-for-profit charity. And the strategic map that we're helping to create, the verbs are explicit. Have you used verbs in that way? And this is where you connect the verbs because it really helps people to understand the activities being discussed.
So Simon, that sounds fascinating, and I look forward to your future presentation on this case study that you're developing, either to this group or your fellow first explorers for Flourishing Business Canvas. I think that would be tremendous.
Yeah, we did do that, but I was just wondering if you guys had connected the verbs with the Flourishing Canvas in this way.
From what you've said, no.
Because the other thing is, just in terms of how we can help people in organisations, it's not a natural. I have this isn't a scientific thing; it's an observational thing. But we've noticed that it's not natural for people to express things in terms of verbs. So we have to kind of help them say, look, here's a statement in the strategic map. Try and articulate this as a verb first. And it really helps people. It's a really, really positive activity in helping people think deeply about how you link all these different parts together and the views.
Great. And once again, it's also an ontological point. So it's like, if you think about the very basic nature of being, is being things, or is being processes? So is it stuff that's out there, or is it what's happening? So this kind of very, very strong underlying question of ontology, of what reality is, I think is one that kind of manifests in how you describe it as well. So it appears from what you say that people are more prone to understand reality as things out there. But if you actually give them that kind of crutch of saying use verbs to describe it, they start describing the processes, which I think is quite helpful and quite an interesting experiment, and pragmatically probably very very valuable.
Yeah, and I think especially when we bring Maria in, because Maria is my wife is a specialist in balanced scorecard and worked with Kaplan and Norton. So yeah, Anthony, we could build on this excellent presentation and talk about that side of things.
Yeah.
But as I said, I don't want to take away, Lee's focus on
no, that's great. I'm very much. I mean,
we find the verbs in this strategic map.
No, it's a great learning for me as well, because Lorenzo Massa and I, we stuck heads together a couple of weeks ago. He came here for a week, and we had really good conversations, and we're trying to go deeper into exactly those connections between those different states, and trying to find out more about what are actually the processes of moving from one state to another, and then of course implications for how you can effect change in practice. So it's not about a theoretical exercise merely. So having all of those inputs and very practical points from you folks on how you actually make that change happen, that's immensely helpful. So I'm very grateful for that. Yeah. Good. So let me move one step further. So we know all that stuff already, and from the discussion, I get the idea that you guys actually have quite a good, not only theoretical but practical capture of what that actually means. So if you want to put it into a similar form of kind of the H2O molecular model that we looked at before, well, the business model, what it is, what its ontology, what it is on an underlying level, could look something like this. So we would have that logic, which we have in the middle, which manifests, or which becomes real in certain forms. So it might be embodied in people as cognition, but it might also be embodied in a kind of deeper way in terms of their habits, the way how they typically do business, not even the explicit cognition they're aware of, but the implicit kind of underlying schemes of how they think and behave, cognitive schemata, and so on. So I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not very good expressing those things theoretically, but it's about everything that's going on in your head in a certain way, and how it connects to who you are and how you behave in a business. And this then, of course, very closely connects to the enacted activities of the business itself, so the activity system that is living, that's going on all the time. But also at the same time, we do have it manifest, become real as artifacts. And then, of course, we do have those different connections between them. So going both ways, how do activities actually become artifacts? So you could take pictures of what you're doing. You could have more kind of technical, quantitative ways of measuring what you're doing. But also you're interested in how do those artifacts actually become something that's cognition, and how does cognition materialize an artifact? So design process, for instance, would be on that area up there, going back and forth between artifacts and between what people have in their heads. Or you could also think about how do activities actually become embodied? So how do the things that you do in a business change the way you think? So just giving examples, this is not meant to be an exclusive list, but this is trying to start a process of finding out how can we actually move between those different states of the business model. But also it comes to a very interesting point about what is this thing in the middle actually? What is this logic? Does it exist independently from those different states? Or is it something that is only there if any of those states is there? And at the same time, which one is the real formula? Which one is the real logic that is enacted? Is it the one that's thought, or is it the one that's materialized, or is it the one that's actually lived and enacted? So that's kind of a mind-boggling thing, and I'm putting that out as a question. I don't have an answer for that. Lorenz and I, we had a very intense session the other day where he was sitting like this and going like, "Ooh, I don't really know what to think about this." So it's quite interesting to think about if we ask this question, what is the logic? What is the value logic of the business? Does it actually, in which one is the true one? If there's a difference between what we have on the canvas and the things we do, and if this is different once again in how people think about the value logic of the business, which one is the one that's really true? Or is there a true one? Yeah.
I think your last point there, Oliver, is perhaps hinting at the way I would start to wrestle with this, which is, of course, there is no one truth. But what I wonder is, if viability is P, C, subscript R, E, and we take the C, subscript A out of the picture and just to say that is viability. What if viability was the emergent property of all three states mediated through those variables? That you know, if you only have a cognitive view of the organization and it has no artifacts and it has no activities, it's not viable. You know, if the organization has activities but it has no story and it has no artifacts, it's not viable. I mean, I can do the logic that way around, I think, in all three cases. So I think this is very tantalizingly interesting. So Simon, I'm really curious, when you did your presentation to us on the philosophical background to your work, my gut's telling me this is quite related to what you were thinking about. It's also quite related. So we do have the new group that's just joining us in the SSBMG is they're community psychologists. So Manuel Rima presented to us last month. Now, he wasn't talking about this type of philosophical perspective on psychology, but I suspect it's going to be really interesting to get his perspective on this. Simon, how do you see this relating to your philosophical approach in holonomics?
Yeah, I think the way we approach it, we have a very, we use like hermeneutics as well, and we have a concept of wholeness, a dynamic notion of wholeness. And the way we work is that the way I kind of explain it is that often you don't ask an architect to go into his technical knowledge or her technical knowledge about material design and depth. The architect will focus on what it is that they're building and what the experience will be for the client. So the way we work is that we're highly influenced by phenomenology and hermeneutics, but we don't talk about this when we're working with clients. What we're doing is we're taking process and systemic methodologies like balanced scorecard and taking a way in which these are into a much deeper ontological realm for our holonomics approach. Again, I'm conscious of time in terms of how we're explaining, but this is very, very in line and in sync with how we work. And that our approach is to say there's no need to criticize things like balanced scorecard. In fact, balanced scorecard is of its time. It's almost as if its time has now arrived. It's just that many people fail to see its systemic nature, and that's because they have quite a mechanistic understanding of systems thinking, or no systems thinking at all. So we work in quite radically different ways to take people into this experiential realm. And the other thing we connect balanced scorecard, strategic maps with the flourishing canvas, with the customer experience, and we bring all of those three elements together. And that's, so, you know, we always talk about where is the soul of the organization articulated? Who experiences it? And it's not just about paying customers or consumers. No, the concept is much, much deeper. And that's where, the flourishing canvas really comes in. So, we're working with the flourishing canvas with many B2B companies. We're working in the extractive industry and really helping to expand people's consciousness inside these levels of organizations so they can really rethink what they're doing and their connections, not just with business customers, but with stakeholders and, of course, the wider community. Because just, here in Brazil, we've had many well-known environmental catastrophes in the last couple of years, and these catastrophes are continuing. So, we're really being listened to with this particular approach. No, I really like it. There's a lot in common. Resonance.
Yeah. I'm also very cognizant, Simon and Oliver, that we've got Bruno Latour's actor network theory reference here from Oliver's 2018 paper, and
I was just about to talk about that for a different reason, but great that you lead into it. Yeah.
Yeah, because this idea that artifacts have agency is a very important idea in this whole space, and I think it talks to the hermeneutic nature very, very strongly, and it gives an explanatory framework. I'm certainly not a Bruno Latour expert, but Peter Jones, one of the co-founders of this group, who I'm very sorry isn't here today. I've just texted him to say he has to watch this and give us some feedback. But he would be all over this from that perspective. I know. Yeah. I just put in the chat a hypothesis for you to have a think about, which you can do later. Anyway, back to you, Oliver. We also would like you to get through the rest of your exciting ideas. So
I will try. Yeah.
You've got about 10 minutes left.
Let's see. That's a challenge, but. Simon, just one small remark. So in this long-range planning paper that Anthony just mentioned, one of the central artifacts that actually brought responsibility and sustainability into that organization was the balanced scorecard. So you might find it interesting to have a look at how it happened in this case as well. So just as a reference down there. So this is the 2018 one, which is on that slide. So let me get practical then. It's very typical, right? Academics are talking 90% of the time about theoretical stuff, and then the practical is in the last 10 minutes anyway. So this is just like different ways of representing what we just talked about. So I think that's relatively straightforward. So this is the more kind of extensive version that we have in that same paper as well, if you want to think about how you move between those different states. So it's not very well developed yet, but it's got kind of pointers at what you could look into to understand how you move from one state to another. So then in terms of examples, so I mentioned this retail company a couple of times already. So just to give you an idea about, so we did over 100 interviews with them. And one of the things I asked everybody in there was, so what's your business model? What does it look like? And so there were very intriguing different answers coming out of it. So if you stay in the cognitive side, so this person called Anna, and that's a alias, of course, says, well, it's your how-to-do guide. So this is kind of what we have in our heads while we do things. Yeah, so this is our business model. And then at the same time, Earl down there was saying, well, that's clear. It's buy, move, and sell. That's the things we do. So it's the activities. And then Nancy up there was saying, well, it's that picture in the annual report. So an artifact quite clearly. But then in the middle, Erica, very interesting, she was saying, well, it's the DNA of the company. So it's in a certain way, it's the kind of basic building blocks, the underlying logic, the thing that's inside everything that we are and that we do. So that's very close to the notion of it being the logic that we talked about before. And then in there, we saw that this notion of being responsible, like a big initiative that they started, actually became part of all of those different parts of how the business model became real in their company. So quite interesting case really. And then there's something that's not been published yet, but that we're in the process of publishing. So this is this company called AllSafe in southern Germany. They're doing fixtures. So fixtures being kind of devices that you put into onto planes, well, sometimes spaceships even, and generally transport in order to hold your load in place, whatever your load might be. So a very kind of technical type of business. But the new owner and at the same time CEO of the business, when he took it over about 10 years ago, actually came in with this kind of humanistic lens. So he wanted to reorganize that business so that it was good first and foremost for the people working in it. So he moved from a kind of customer-centric perspective to an employee-centric perspective. So his idea was about human flourishing, so helping people to be the best version of themselves in that business and to be to create a business that's based on humanistic principles. So again, there's a lot to go into much deeper, but once again, the question how it materialized. So if you look on the left-hand side up here, so this is the book the founder of the company wrote. So I think the picture is very telling. So basically, he's got a person there, and the head is missing. But the point is really that this philosophy, this logic of managing the business for the welfare, for the flourishing of people, this is what is in the head of people in that business. And then down here we've got a picture of people's profiles as they were glued to the wall in the production facilities, where people describe their philosophy of how this business should be run, and what they can contribute to it. So once again, kind of gives a glimpse of how the business model becomes part of people's cognition. And then on the right-hand side, we have the production facilities, if you look in the back. So one of the main points when they moved into the new location was to say, well, actually part of this humanistic thinking is kind of very egalitarian thinking of we're all alike, we're all the same, we're all human beings. So it doesn't make sense to have a physical separation as well. And typically production facilities in that industry are ground level, people work in the factory, first level, first story up is the kind of administrative people who wear suits. And they actively said, okay, no, we actually want to represent this egalitarian idea of we're all human beings, we're all alike and we're all the same. There shouldn't be any hierarchies. They translated that into the building and made it a one-story building where everybody's on the same floor. You might say that's a little bit silly and it's a very, very simple thing, but it was an active, deliberate decision to actually materialize this kind of humanistic thinking even in the production facility and in the architecture. And then down there we do have a couple of pictures of the activities. So once again, for instance, the way meetings are done, the one in the middle, everybody's just standing up in the middle of one of the production halls, and well, actually the people working in administration are just standing intermingled with everybody else working in production. Everybody has a voice, everybody can speak up, everybody is at the forefront of what's happening, and including the CEO just standing as part of the group there. So you see how things are organized, how things are practiced, how activities are implemented, once again represents that idea. Yeah? And then Simon's saying, we offer a range of materials to allow people to create what they are visualizing. Lego Play, oh wow, yeah. I love Lego methodologies in class as well. That's a kind of slightly different topic, but yeah, nice. So that's another example. I'm just trying to, I do rush through them right now a little bit, just to see if maybe we still can get maybe 2 minutes of discussion or comments at the end out of it. So this is the Grayston example. Once again, so their idea is, and the very, very reason and origin of this business is to try to find out how to hire people and give them a subsistence in the community of Yonkers, close to New York City. So they're doing brownies, baking brownies, but they're also running a foundation at the same time, and all the profits of the bakery actually go into the foundation in order to improve still the community life also in different ways. And once again, you see the people on the left-hand side. So you see, for instance, those 2 Buddhist monks down there. One of them is the founder of the company, Bernie Glassman. And then we do have kind of when like-minded people meet. Well, this in here is actually the faces of myself and my colleague Ruth, who are doing research there. But originally, those were the faces of course, the Ben & Jerry's founders. But then what happened was that Bernie Glassman, with his idea about social impact through business, was very met those two guys and very closely connected to what they were doing, which was one of the very first large-scale contracts that Grayston Bakery had with Ben & Jerry's. So you see, it's very much about the kind of philosophy, the logic of doing business in people's heads, but it's also about how it materialized. And Grayston's, for instance, in their logo, so they call it the Grayston Mandala part of it. So you see that this kind of interlinked thing right in the middle, I understand, represents how the foundation and how the bakery work together. So you get the logic, that hybrid logic, also materialized in their logo. You've got the foundation building down there, and also you do have then the activities of the company, and both of them would be very hands-on, actually doing the baking, but at the same time also trying to pass on this idea of open hiring to other businesses and help other businesses to get this activity system going somewhere else as well, to pass on this open hiring business model to other places as well. So in all of this is still like on a rather static level. If you think about more pragmatically, how can we actually start changing what's out there? This is something I just started drafting up yesterday, so sorry for the very rudimentary state it is in different different research project that we're doing right now on Chinese bike sharing. So that's happening right in front of, so I can actually see it from up here right now happening. Where I was trying to find out how did the bike sharing business model actually change over the last couple of years, because it was just 5 years ago that the city of Ningbo here implemented a public bike sharing model. But then at the same time, this public bike sharing very, very quickly was overtaken by those private dockless bike sharing companies. So Ofo and Mobike and so on. Many of them have gone abroad and are public are all over the world right now as well. But apparently this dockless normal kind of non-e-bike sharing now once again is receiving kind of a fundamental shift towards private e-bike sharing with a completely different business model once again. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go too deeply into this, but just to give you an idea about how those different states, so cognition, artifacts, activities, and how business model change in this example actually started in one of the states, but then spread through the other ones as well. So I think the message here is to think about, if we want to change business models, we might also very pragmatically start thinking about which of those states can be used in order to impact change throughout the other states as well. Yeah. So business model innovation, I think, is interesting here, but also if we're in the founding process of a new business. This is the research project of Xuan Ye, who I just mentioned before, my PhD student, who's interested in how the business model actually changes through the startup process and how in different stages the different manifestations of the business model change as well. So just to conclude, because I know we are probably right on time, still might have a minute. So the point is to say, well, the core of the business model, if you move from the model towards a logic, we do have those proposition, creation, exchange, and capture, which then might manifest in different stages. So those different states that we looked before are in a certain way this value logic. And then if you're interested in how do business models actually change, well, we cannot directly touch this value logic, because this is something that somewhere floats in the air between those different states. We have to start changing one or several of those states in order to change the overall value logic, the logic of how a business has or the value proposition, the creation, exchange, and capture of a particular business. So this is kind of the high-level overview, and I apologize for rushing through that last bit, but I thought it was important to actually have seen all of that in order to keep the conversation going, maybe just a little bit right now and hopefully for a longer time afterwards. That's where I shut up.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Just a couple of closing comments from me. First of all, I want to congratulate you, Oliver. it's been a little while since we've had a technical deep dive as such as you've and done in such an exploratory way. And I really want to highlight to everybody that this is one of the benefits of this community. I think, Oliver, you've experienced, it's not so easy to find a group of people to bounce an idea off that's, you know, reasonably, somewhat developed, but is still needing further work, and to be able to engage in a conversation. So this is exactly why we're here, to be able to provide that. I'm also delighted that you were attempting to connect it to practice the whole way through, and I think that's also very important for many people on this call. Yeah, thank you, Oliver. That was tremendous. And
well, thank you so much for giving me that opportunity. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's. I mean, this is you know, the members of the group. This group is by its members for its members, and I think we've amply demonstrated that value co-creation today. I just wanted to add, Peter Jones apologises for not being able to attend. He's been on a pretty intensive travelling today, and said that he had read the pitch for the article and had guessed that this is where you might take things, and was sorry not to be able to be able to join, but I wanted you to share that. In terms of our presentation next month, just to close on that, we have two possible presentations, and I don't yet know which one it's going to be. So on two completely different topics. One is by our members from the Department of Environment and Land Use Planning in the Flemish government in Belgium, who have been doing some fascinating research on why do green business models not stick? Why have people not been adopting them? And what policy interventions they could adopt that might change that, including some workshops, including exploring how business modeling and a better business modeling tool like the Flourishing Business Canvas might enable better policy outcomes. So that's one possible presentation for next month, and if it's not next month, it'll be later in the summer. And the other presentation is, many of you know that along with the Flourishing Business Canvas, there is also now a method for its use with existing organizations to do strategy development. And there's a new book coming out, edited by one of our members, Thomas Wunder, on rethinking strategy for impact. And that book has chapters in it from many of our members. And so we may feature one of those chapters next month, or we may feature the book next month, still working out the details. So there's a few possibilities that will emerge over the coming months, I think, is perhaps the right way to think about it. So thank you again, Oliver. Thank you all for joining in.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, great meeting. Super happy.
Thanks, Oliver. It was excellent. Cheers.
When you've done some more thinking, Oliver, don't hesitate and come back and tell us about it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, because I was a little bit worried that it might be a little bit too theoretical, but I get from the discussions that it's actually something that does connect to what many of you guys are doing. So thanks a lot for that input as well.
Absolutely, and hopefully see you in Berlin.
Yes, I will be there. I will be there, definitely.
I and several other people will be there in Berlin.
Oh, great. Yeah, let's connect. That would be great.
All right. See you soon.
Right, see you guys then. Bye-bye.
See you this time next month. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Nicole.
Oliver?
There's my mic again. Yeah. Hello.
Oh, hey. Do you have a second? I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
So from what I understand, so in terms of the chemistry and what you're talking about and the cognition aspect of it, do you see that as, like, if I'm understanding that correctly, do you see that as the evolution of the business, like what is essentially missing? Like in terms of the ability to put that cognition or to conceptualize that cognition into the business model?
There is, so there's a couple of articles that start thinking about it in terms of cognition, but there's not a lot out there yet. So
Right.
So I think that's something that's actually quite interesting to explore. So particularly if you're doing a PhD right now, who knows? Maybe you're at some point in time you might drift towards that direction. My both of my PhD students, they're attaching to connecting to the cognition part now as well. So they're trying to find out how does the business model actually become something that's in people's heads, and how do people then again reshape it based on what they have in their heads. So yeah, that's quite an interesting one, and there's not a lot out there yet.
Well, it's sort of interesting, right? Because this connection between sustainability, right? Like where I think they were talking about that stickiness of why aren't these companies flipping, and the idea of the really key point I think that really resonated for me was this idea of the mechanistics approach to strategy, and not recognizing that it's a cognition approach as well, right? And that's sort of like where Capra is sort of talking, and it's sort of fascinating to me that. Sort of when you approach it from a cognition standpoint, where it's the collectiveness of everybody's thoughts, like how do you capture, like that's something that's fascinating to me, is trying to capture that in the tools that we have, right? Like even our system tools don't capture a level of, like they capture sort of community and ecology, but they don't capture, if you were to overlay that onto a cognitive body, which I think is very interesting. So I just was sort of wondering if that was sort of one of the like areas that you were sort of where your research might eventually go, is this idea that could you pattern cognition into the model?
I'm even before the patterning it in part, I think there's a very practical question about how do you get things out of people's heads into a shareable format in a certain way, because much of it is implicit, it is tacit, it's not something that people actively know.
Right.
And even if they knew, if you're doing, and so you've got all of those things, if you're doing interviews like all the type of different biases you can get, and why people don't exactly say the way how they think the world. So it's also on a methods level, it's really, really tricky. And that's probably why people have tended to mostly talk about the activities part, because you can observe it, and often about the devices part, because you see the devices, you have them, and cognition is something you cannot just see.
Right. Well, it's sort of.
So I'm not really answering questions. I'm just saying it's difficult, but it's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, no, and I think it was interesting that you used a chemical model, right? So you're sort of getting into a replication and duplicate, like that the translation of energy, right? And so if you were to take your model and say, okay, I'm going to make a molecule now, like what you're saying, like, well, what is, like, I almost wonder if it's something like, the chakras on a body sort of talk a little about, like, they're big sort of transmitters of that energy. And I'm wondering if, I'm just riffing, I just find it very interesting. And when I was reading it, that idea that cognition maybe is that translation of energy into sort of just a vibrational form.
Very
right?
Interesting, yeah.
So, Nicole, have you in the last?
Sorry, I want to talk. Hold on. I wanted to ask a question.
So to link energy and cognition, have both of you seen the recent work? And I'm going to forget his name. I can find it easily enough, though. He's a British I want to say neurobiologist, I think. So he's interested in the neurochemistry in the brain. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, he seems to be linking it to non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which of course is a purely physical a way of explaining how structure and order emerges from chaos, which of course is antithetical to the second law of thermodynamics, so he is making the link that you've just hypothesized, Nicole, and he seems to be getting evidence to suggest that cognition is actually an expression of the of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And certainly others, people like Alan Tater and Hoekstra in supply-side sustainability, have already made the argument that social structures like organizations are definitely an expression of structure emerging from chaos through processes of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. I found a video by this guy. He's extremely dry. I think actually he was the way I heard about him recently is he had an article about him in Wired, of all places. Let me see if I can find it.
So one of the questions I challenged Stephen on in one of our second lab questions is this idea of, like, this is really fascinating on the model, right? So we were talking about strategy from the 3 horizons model. And then I said, well, so I guess my question is in panarchy, right? The panarchy model really talks about the translation of energy from a slower moving system, like a faster to slower moving system. And then when you overlay sort of what you're talking about, like this idea that you have artifacts and you've got the cognition, like my question is what drives the shift, right? So when, and so that's the fascination that I find in is it the cognition that drives the shift, right? Because you're putting the energy out of the thought and you're actually translating that now into the shift, and the model's trying to capture that, right? Or like what, and so what's driving that? So anyways, I don't know, but it was just, it's just, I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
The chemical.
And I think it's really a, I think this kind of metaphor doesn't give a lot of answers, but it raises a lot of questions, which I was hoping it would be doing. So exactly the type of questions that you're coming up with right now. And my own thinking, that's reflected in a way of trying to think about patterns of business model change. So I think similar to what you're saying, to think, does it start with cognition, or does it start with the artifact, or does it start in the activity? And I assume, I don't know because I haven't done anything empirically on that, I assume that there's different patterns of how business model change happens that starts on either one of those. So this thing I just showed very briefly before about the bike sharing here in China. So if you see just the horizontal arrows, the red arrows that were on there, this is where it moves from one business model to another. And in those 2 shifts that I have in there, actually that starts on different levels. So it starts once where I think it's exactly about the physical one. So all of a sudden we actually do have apps with GPS functioning, which means we don't need fixed docks. We don't need stations for bike sharing anymore. So the material aspect, the artifact changes first. And then we realize, oh, look, actually now that we can track where our bikes are, we're not worried about leaving them in particular places. We can actually, through an app, give anybody access to bikes at any time, anywhere. It doesn't really matter anymore. Right. Which then of course changes the thinking, like the cognitive pattern, how you think about using bike sharing in your head. And it changes also the underlying activity, because all of a sudden you also need to have a much more stronger point on deposit, because people, so economically positive, because people can leave them anywhere. They can leave them in a river if they want to. So somewhere,
which we saw in France,
which happens not only in France, even in China, where there's cameras everywhere. But this then means that you get a deposit, which means you have to do something with the deposit. All of a sudden, what wasn't really of concern at all was how you actually invest money. Before it was how do you get money in order to buy your bikes. Now it becomes, I've got an excess of money. I become an investment business all of a sudden. So in the activity parts, the business model changed considerably, because the large part of what they're doing is investing their deposits. Right. So you see, like it starts at different levels, but then the next one is really about people saying, well, okay, so I like the sharing idea and the kind of accessibility of it, but I really don't want to pedal on a bike through a polluted Chinese city. So the mindset part of how people use it and how people represent it, what it represents in their heads. In this case, the kind of preferences and also the kind of the sensory feeling of does it feel good or bad doing that, leads to them saying, well, actually, I want to use my e-scooter. Everybody's using private e-scooters anyway. But if I'm on 2 wheels, I want to be on 2 wheels where I don't have to pedal. And all of a sudden, the e-bike sharing comes up. So there, the change happens in the cognitive part. So so I'm just saying that to say like it helps. I think it helps thinking about business model change once again in a different way, and understanding better why business model changed, and then as a consequence also how can you make business model change.
Yeah, well, and I think you've hit on a really fascinating point there. Whereas it goes back to that conversation that, and I don't know if it was you said that or Simon said that, where this idea that we think binary in our modeling, right? Like we don't recognize that, there's a lot of stuff going on at one point, and the tools that we're using to capture that, like how do you capture that 3-dimensional what you just talked about? and put it into a model and say, there's a snapshot of the outcome of all of this, right? That goes into the model, as opposed to like now looking at it, like you say, from a non-mechanistic systems perspective. Anyways, I just find it really fascinating. So thank you for, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree, Nicole. We obviously didn't get a chance to talk about it, but that last slide that you had, which started to talk about the work your PhD student is doing about how business models change over time. This aspect, this dynamic aspect, is absolutely critical because, to the point Nicole's making, we're in practice suggesting that the only way for somebody to intentionally try to have a strategy that helps create the future that they want, i.e. a flourishing future for their company in an environment and a society that is also has the possibility for flourishing, the only way to do that is by backcasting. And so that means from a business modeling perspective, you actually have to design not only your next business model, which is what typical strategy processes would be talking about.
Right.
You actually have to first design your far future business model and then design your next one in light of where you're trying to get to. So if you take that diagram your student had put together with how the business model changes over time, now that was a representation, I think, of an actual evolution over time. But when you flip that from an actual mode into a design mode, so you're moving from trying to describe what has happened into trying to design what you would like to happen, what happens is that the sequence of those three models, of the modeling, changes. So you actually start with, yes, an understanding of where you are, but then you actually jump to the far future to come back into the middle. And this has some extremely interesting implications, which Nicole is now starting to unpack just then. I think there is a so when your PhD student gets a little further through his work, her work, their work.
His work. I mean, there's two of them. There's he and there's she. But
I would really encourage them to share some of their thinking with us, and that they should definitely take a look at this book this book by Thomas Wunder that's coming out. I think you know Thomas.
I do want to say yes, but I'm not. Tell me a little bit more about him again.
So he's a strategy prof. He is the.
Sure. No. We had I remember now. We had lunch together in Chicago, actually. Yeah.
That's right. Yes. So Thomas has managed to get Henry Mintzberg to write the introductory chapter to this book, and it's going to be featured at AOM in Boston in August. So we have a chapter in there, as does Florian and quite a few other people in the SSBMG, so backcasting and a number of other techniques that have previously not really been employed by strategists at all, and business modeling being another one. Is now being mainstreamed by what Thomas is doing. And with Mintzberg putting in the introductory chapter, it really could reframe the field if it has the impact that we kind of hope it does. So that book's published in later this month or early next month.
But I remember now, actually, he asked me to do something for it as well. And I was just too busy at this time. It's a shame, Okay, no, great.
The other thing I just wanted to connect to here is I just put into the chat this video by Carl Friston just to connect to something else, Nicole, you were saying earlier. So it's the guy's Carl Friston, and he as I said, he's a cognitive psychologist, physiologist, biologist. So he's talking about Bayesian energy levels in neurons in the brain. But he's relating it to non-equilibrium thermodynamics and what he calls embodied cognition. And of course, the reason why I heard about it was because people are wondering whether any of this could inform the design of artificial intelligences, which links very nicely back to an ontology. So I put the links to the original Wired article, and there's a 15-minute video interview with him, which is pretty good. So anyway, it's just fascinating how these things appear to be fitting together.
Well,
Yeah.
so here's the thing, right? When something transforms, there's a moment, whether it's on the quantum level, that there's a space that happens, that's created, right? Where something can get in. And the reason why I say that is because right now in cybersecurity, they're recognizing hackers have figured out how to get in when something translates from a system to a system. So for instance, in the translation of data, there's a moment, a split second, where the hacker can get in and blow up the system, right? And they're starting to figure that out now with more sophistication. So my question would be is, even in a business model, at some point there's, in that backcasting, there's going to be a translation of energy. Even if it's at the quantum level, there's a metaphor there for being able to make an intervention at the precise moment in time that will shift all those things you're talking about, right? So you're getting into almost like a temporal conversation now, right? In strategy, right? So for instance, like on the 3 horizons model, they talk about temporal. So in that moment when those horizons collide, there's an opportunity for shift. And the question is how does that shift happen? Does it happen with the cognition first? Right? And so that's what's fascinating about the allegory you have here, is because you're identifying the points in that moment of transition where you can get in and make the shift happens, even as it's quantum level. And I know that's like
interesting idea,
crazy ass, whatever, just the grad student here, but like I was just like, but that's the fascinating point.
That's the kind of very intriguing thoughts that are very worth exploring further, I think. Yeah.
But you're seeing this right now in the hacker community. So that's interesting that what's this guy and whatever, because at some point, if we get that sophisticated with computer technology, like even if you think about reproduction in human beings, at some point there has to be a translation of when, you know, that when sort of the egg and the sperm hits, there's an opening somewhere, right? So if artificial intelligence could get in and figure that out before we do, they could actually intervene in that moment, right? They could actually replicate and duplicate that. I know that's a weird analogy, but theoretically,
I think it's interesting also because so it makes me think about so Anthony mentioned this actor network theory work before, and translation is kind of the central process, how they frame how change happens. So they're saying translation is the process where, and that's what I'm talking about in this paper that we where this whole kind of triangular model came from as well. That they say basically, well, anyway, I'm going to say how I explained because I don't want to kind of misquote the early actor network theory guys. So what I'm trying to say is that a business model basically is a network of different actors. That can be human or non-human actors, but that doesn't really matter because they're doing everything together anyway. But so if it's an actor network, then the way it changes is through translation. Translation means that the logic of one actor is somehow interacting with the logic of another actor, and they're talking to each other and trying to make sure that they understand each other. They translate back and forth until their logics are roughly the same. So this means in this case, if you have an artifact, so if you have the business model canvas as an actor, and this business model canvas goes out there with a certain logic which is different from everybody else's logic, then they engage in translation, and you might have at some point in time this, as you said before, that kind of gap in between where it's open, right? So where it's neither this one nor that one, and where you can have big change happening as well. But also I think it in a certain way it also challenges your point of this gap, because that translation doesn't happen at the same time, because this kind of thing, it moves through the organization and it translates to different actors at different points in time. So there's not this kind of coexistence of that gap at all of those between all of those actors at the same time, but it's kind of sequenced, which makes that opening to be probably not as impactful. You could just have that opening between two actors in one translation at one time.
So I think this starts to provide an explanatory framework for why, which I don't think we've really had before, which is, you know, Osterwalder was the one who I believe originally said all a business model tool is a common language to enable better conversations. But I'm not sure we've actually had a explanatory framework presented in the literature about why that's true. And I think what you've just started to articulate there, Oliver, if I understood you well, an explanatory framework based on this model about why when a group of people get together and they create an artifact, a business model, so they create a model of something that isn't real, the organization, that only exists in their multiple minds, to use Gaja Haradi's terminology, why that actually helps with individual and shared cognition. Right? It's the connection between those things that's actually being facilitated, and it's flowing backwards and forwards. So it's almost like you've got sublimation and all those three arrows going on is actually all going on through that process of business modeling between the various. I need to go, but I just wanted to. I just wanted to.
Yes, actually, I'm having a PhD class later on, which is I think I'm going to be horrible.
Yeah, sorry. Well, anyways, I appreciate you taking that moment, Oliver, to ask my question.
Yeah, very much. It's very interesting. Thanks for bringing up that question. I think the thought is very interesting. Yeah.
So if you want to save the chat, Oliver, we will put the chat into the folder with your presentation and the recording, but you can also save it locally if you want to. There's a little more button down there that you can use to save. The other thing I wanted to say is Peter and I have also been chatting in the background, I think he's kicking himself for a little bit that he didn't come, although the conversation would have been very different if Peter had come, as Nicole and I both know. But it would have also been good. But Peter has asked, because Peter, as I said, is a big Latourian fan. He would be really grateful. But the trouble is with OCAD is we don't have access to a lot of the articles. So I don't know if you've got manuscripts of your papers up online somewhere.
Yeah, actually, let me share it right now, because this way I'm sure we've got it.
Could you just hop into the LinkedIn group and make the post to the comments to this meeting, and then everybody gets the links?
Okay, yeah.
Is that possible? Hang on, I'll get you the link to the post, and then you can do it really fast. Because I also recognize we've got to make this easy for you. Hold on just one second.
Yeah, and I've copied I've actually made sure the chat's been copied from today. So it's already in the SSBMG folder as well.
Oh, okay, great.
And the recording will be there in about an hour's time.
Yeah. Well, it's got to process, and we're still recording this now, by the way.
Oh, are we?
Okay. The thing, no, that's good. Actually, I like that. Hopefully, is it okay if you put that online as well? Because also this kind of follow-up discussion, I think it's very relevant.
No, I think that's good. Yeah. I mean, we do want to encourage this stuff to happen. Here's the link, Oliver. That's the link to your post. So if you just want to post your papers. And I will then mention to Peter that you've done that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Cool. I'm gonna do that.
That was great.
All right, folks. Well, thanks a lot. Really nice speaking to you. And hopefully we're gonna be in touch.
Yeah, I'm gonna come to Berlin. So.
Yay! Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So pretty excited about that.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
Well, then have a good rest of the day, and see you soon then.
Yes, good luck. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver, and see you in July.
Yeah, see you then. Bye.
Yeah, you can go get a drink, bud. Sorry. Thanks. All right.